This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Live and Learn. I'm Chua and Teck. Our minimum wage was recently set at 1,050 ringgit, an increase from 1,000 in the Peninsula and 920 ringgit in East Malaysia. My guest today believes this is a misguided move. Carmelo Ferlito is a senior fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, better known as IDEAS. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here again.
Yes, very interested to hear your views on this because you were quoted last year when the current government was still then the opposition, and they were mooting this idea of increasing the minimum wage to 1,500 ringgit. And you came out and say, maybe that's not the best move because it will affect the more than 1 million low-skilled workers in Malaysia. Can I get you to elaborate on that?
Yes, sure. You see, when you are an entrepreneur and you decide if hiring people or buying machines to do a certain job, of course you take this decision based on price considerations. So if labor becomes too expensive, you get indirectly an incentive to replace labor with machines. And here again we are talking about unskilled labor, so that labor that is more easily subject to be replaced by machines. So even if I understand the good feelings behind, the good heart behind such a proposal, I tend to warn, be careful, because the risk is to do more harm than good to these people that cannot, as we say in a technical jargon, cannot command a certain high salary because of the low skills that they have, and therefore the risk that you have by increasing their salary by law is that they don't get paid more, but they are expelled from the labor market.
Right. But the implication of that is these low-skilled workers would forever be consigned to that wage level, isn't it? Because, as you mentioned, if the wage or cost of hiring them become higher, employers would choose automation or machines. So aren't we just delaying the inevitable of this replacement of technology or machines and automation over unskilled labor?
Of course, a replacement is physiological as long as the salaries and the cost of labor is increasing. But the key for these workers to overcome this problem is indeed education, I believe. So they can aim to a better living standard by increasing their skills rather than simply thinking of increasing their salary.
Right. So I suppose that would be what proponents of a minimum wage or having a wage floor is, that this will encourage low-skilled workers to upskill themselves as to not be contented or stay in a job where wage will be stagnated for the foreseeable future.
In a way, but also we have to consider that there will be a part of low-skilled workers that will be always necessary. And you can see Malaysia is an example similar to other to some Western countries in which certain kind of jobs don't want to be performed by local workers because they indeed improve their education and they consider a social minus to accept a certain kind of job, and therefore we are forced to import foreign workers. And for them, even that small salary is good enough to provide for themselves and to send money back home. So if they come here and they accept that salary, it means that for them is anyway better than working back in their country. So they consider this an advantage. And a country like Malaysia is providing these people also with opportunities. Some of them are able to reinvent themselves after their contracts expire, like doing works inside houses, repairing, plumbers, and this kind of people are becoming high in demand.
So you say, you're arguing that by increasing minimum wage, the more than 1 million low-skilled workers in Malaysia will have their job security be affected, that they might lose their jobs?
Yes, that is one possibility. Of course, it is difficult to quantify, and it will really depend on the different industries, the different workers. But I just make an example where I live. The shopping mall in front of the place where I live a few years back had humans collecting the payments for the car park. After the previous government raised the minimum wage, these workers were replaced by auto-pay machines. So the conditions of these workers, and the aim of the law was to improve the conditions of this worker, but the final result was that they lost the job and they were replaced by machines. This is a very actual example of what happened in the past.
So that is very in line with the conventional wisdom in economics, isn't it? That increasing minimum wage will lead to a reduction in employment. You cited that very tangible example of how automation or machines replace an actual human being. But this accepted wisdom of how minimum wage would lead to a reduction in employment came from a 1992 study in economics about how fast food restaurants in New Jersey, I believe, were trying out this new initiative of whether how minimum wage affect workers at a fast food restaurant. At the time, automation wasn't yet a big concern. Has the assumptions that we made since then changed or evolved today? Like, are there anything that you're looking at now that economists weren't looking back then about the effects of minimum wage on economies?
Actually, there was a study published, I believe, at the beginning of this year, in which that assumptions are confirmed, and an increase in minimum wage is indeed a negative incentive toward hiring human beings, and rather is an incentive to employ machines. But this is a normal consideration. Again, when you have to decide an investment, when you have to make consideration about which kind of factors to use for your capital structure, you base your considerations on the structure of the relative prices.
Yeah.
So the more expensive gets one of the factors, relatively the other factors become cheaper. Of course, there is a limit until you can push, and then once this limit will be overcome, then you start introducing machines. And of course, the risk is higher for unskilled workers, because that kind of jobs can be replaced by machines. You cannot, if you have a good product developer or a very performing salesperson, you can't replace these people with machines. But in assembling lines or parking or collection of fruits, then is where you have margin for automation.
Yeah, e-commerce is replacing salespeople too, isn't it?
Depends. I mean, e-commerce is like a shop. So you know already what you want to buy, and you go on a certain website in order to get a product. So you don't need to get convinced. But when you need to get convinced, then you need someone that convinces you.
Yeah. Okay. So minimum wage, bad for business. Do you see any good in it? Are there any maybe social value to increasing, maybe as a symbolic value, or that has positive externalities?
Okay, yes, there is a a positive thought behind this. I recognize that, and I share that concern. So don't get me wrong. I don't want to have people starving. So I recognize the right feelings behind this social concern, and I agree with them. But then, technically speaking, we have to consider which is the best way to address that social concern. And I believe that rather than focusing on minimum wage, and again, the percentage of workers affected by minimum wage in Malaysia is very low. But rather than focusing on a minimum wage, I would focus on certain human conditions around the job place. So be sure that these people, are earning a salary which is dictated by market forces, so they get what they can indeed provide to their employer, but we can, the government can eventually intervene with a framework that makes the life of these people with more dignity, that they can live with more dignity, so that the place in which they live has to be clean, that they have to have access to clean water, that the conditions of work are safe, that they cannot go on a construction site with a flip-flop. So the way in which we try to preserve the dignity of labor. So I think that this will be a more effective way to take care of that concern. But let the price for their services to be decided in the market.
Right. So regulate or institutionalize workplace conditions and environment. Oh, okay. Let's take a short break. We'll come back and discuss other alternatives to the minimum wage if indeed it is a bad idea to increase people's income. Stay tuned. BFM 89.9. Welcome back. You're listening to Live and Learn. I'm Chua and Teck. With me in the studio today, Carmelo Ferlito, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, better known as IDEAS. We're discussing minimum wage and whether or not it's a good or bad idea. Carmelo thinks it's not the best idea if you are looking to increase the income of your working population. So you mentioned the fact that very little people will be affected by this minimum wage policy. In fact, I think you cited official statistics in 2014 that only 1.6% of the population was earning less than 1,000 per month anyway. So why is this such a political issue? Not just in Malaysia, right? Around the world as well. It's a political hot potato.
Yes, well, indeed, this is politics. You always try to, I guess I'm not a politician, but probably politicians try to raise topics that seems to be sensitive for the population. And we know from the public choice school that voters are rationally ignorant. So the cost for them to have access to sound information in the democratic process is too high, so they tend not to be really informed. But instead, we as scholars, we get access to information. So again, I say is only 1.5% of the working population earning less than that. So it is really politically relevant as a topic beyond ideological discussions. Then so maybe we should ask to the politicians promoting this why they insist on this topic, why they consider this important. For me, of course, it's not that it's not important. It has its relevance, but is a relative relevance. So regarding a very small amount of the working population in Malaysia, and therefore we should consider it for what it is. Yeah. It's not really a priority probably in this moment in Malaysia. The average worker is earning already much more than that. We have recently got statistics about the median income. The recent one tell us that is already at 5,000 plus ringgit per month, the median income for the households. So
So I guess supporters of this policy of a minimum wage would cite those things back at you, right? That since it affects so little of the population already anyway, and it's such a low-hanging fruit, why can't we just proceed with it? And isn't it better than cash transfer policies, because this one is tied to employment, money goes out to someone who actually has a job rather than them taking the money through welfare and spending it on something that is maybe harmful to them or not so productive. And one last thing is that the money that they get will be returned to the economy because they have extra cash, extra disposable income for them to buy groceries or daily essentials to cope with the cost of living. What would you say to all these arguments?
This is a very Keynesian argument. Again, I would come back to my initial consideration. If the final outcome of increasing their minimum wage is not for them to have more money, but to have zero money because they get fired, then that payback effect that you are quoting on consumption, in example, will never happen. Because these people will not go from 1,000 to 1,500, but will go from 1,000 to zero. So no money, no spending.
Right. Okay.
So again, if a certain, we have to consider these people earning this amount of money are forced or they freely accept to work for that amount of money. If they freely accept this market rate, it means that it is at least the less worst scenario for them, and this is what their skills can command in the market. And if we probably raise it, we are going to harm them in the sense that they will be expelled from the labor market.
Okay. So one argument that critics of minimum wage also make, and this is very common in our debate about minimum wage, is that companies will just uproot and leave to a place where labor is not so costly. Is that a fair comment to make, that companies are always in pursuit of cheaper labor?
Well, I would say that companies are always looking for profit opportunities. So, of course, as everybody tends to get better off on a bigger scale, entrepreneurs try to do the same. And in order to increase your margin, one of the possible strategies is to reduce your costs. And, of course, labor is part of the cost. So whenever there are opportunities to move somewhere else, they will try when they can to exploit these opportunities. But I don't really think that in the long run this is a winning strategy. You can see an example companies that moved to China in the past decades because labor was cheap in China, and companies that moved to China because China was becoming the biggest potential market for their products. This second group of firms is still in China because look at China as a market. The companies that look at China as a source of cheap labor are forced to move and probably are losing business. So I think that in the medium and long run, the market will judge positively those entrepreneurs that are wiser and look at countries as markets. The same can be said for Indonesia, in example. You are going to Indonesia because there is a cheap labor or because there is a huge potential market. So, of course, you exploit the advantage of a cheap labor as well. But then if you are in a certain country because that market is strategic for you, then whenever the labor cost is increasing, you don't leave that market. Because you are still interested in that.
Right. Okay. When this minimum wage proposal was still in its infancy stage, that some politicians have suggested or mooted that to make this palatable to the private sector, that the government subsidize some of this increase. The idea is that the public share the burden with the private sector to increase the minimum wage for a while. What do you think of that?
Well, probably only the companies would be happy because they get some of their costs shared by the government. But in the medium run, I don't think that government subsidies are a good strategy for anything. In the end, we have to start from the assumption that government does not produce any wealth, any income. So if we are going to put some resources in somewhere, they have to get these resources from another place. That means increasing taxation, moving from another industry. So whenever this money has to be sourced and they strategically decide to move there, why? So the final outcome is that someone else will be disappointed because of these resources, and we have seen in the recent news, resources are not endless,
Yeah.
and someone else sooner or later will have to pay.
Correct. Well, it's interesting that you frame it in that way, because I think another way to frame it is that a government, true, does not produce wealth, but they are a reallocator of resources. They take where there is money to give to where there is no money. This redistribution model, is it not something that government should be actively taking charge of to address imbalances in the economies?
This is a very controversial topic that might take a full day or a full week to be discussed.
Well, let's talk about look at it through the angle of a minimum wage, right? Because the government can help in this way to, I guess, increase the wage of those who are the least privileged, while maybe taxing higher those who can afford to pay more taxes.
Of course, such a move is based on the assumption that you recognize that the government knows what is best for the country, for the people in general, and they can efficiently decide how to redistribute resources. And I argue that this is not really the case. So this is I have a general philosophical objection on this, on the fact that the government should decide what is best for the country and therefore how to reallocate resources from one group of people to another group of people. Because you can look it from another angle. As more as a rich company become richer, it creates opportunities also for the less privileged people. But the more you are going to take out resources from the people that can produce wealth, the more you create negative incentives for them to create this wealth and therefore to eventually hire more people and create opportunities for the less privileged. So we have to look at the complexity of this kind of argument that is ideologically very strong, and I understand that it has a grasp on the people. We all think it's very reasonable to think like Robin Hood, let's say, to take from the wealthy to give to the less wealthy. But I believe that the best way to create richness for the less privileged people is to have the people that can create wealth, to have them free to create this wealth. Let the companies grow and they will hire people. And coming also from a business background, I know that valuable people need to be paid and paid well if you recognize they are an added value for you.
Okay.
This is the best way of redistributing resources.
I mean, there's a whole other 2 or 3 shows we can do if we want to go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so let's leave that aside first and come back to minimum wage. If this wage floor is not something that we should pursue in order to address wage stagnation or higher cost of living, what would your policy recommendations be other than workplace environment?
in order to increase
address
to address
high cost of living or people not making enough money.
This is, of course, another hot topic, and I believe that the best way is always education, in the sense that and a good education that put the people in the conditions to face market challenge and therefore to be recognized as assets for employers. In this way, employers would be happy to grant better conditions to the workers. That I think is a long path, but I think is the only durable path to prosperity. There will be always economic shocks. This is unavoidable. There are moments in which the living conditions are better, other in which they are worse. But in general, the long way to prosperity pass through education, promoting a mentality toward innovation, and here education is key. Culture.
Right. You're talking about not just education in the sense that primary school and university, right? You're talking also about on-the-job training and things like that.
That is important for sure, but the preliminary conditions need to be created, of course, in the family, which is the first education institution, and then during the traditional education path. I see, unluckily, universities or schools are often focused on printing degrees, so they just want people to get graduated rather than embracing a wider perspective on education in the sense of really forging the future generations. So probably this kind of talk goes beyond the competencies of an economist, but in general also as an educator, I think that we have a mission of recognizing skills and promoting critical approach, critical mentality. This is a big problem, even in economics, the subject that I teach in a college here. Often we see the proposition of a textbook. This is the gospel. You have to learn it, know it, pass the exam, and go. But in social sciences, there are no gospels. Everything can be subject to critics. So we have to help the kids to develop this critical approach, to discover themselves. This is the task of education, to help these guys to discover their real vocation. And if the real vocation, in example and paradoxically, is to be a plumber, help this guy, this girl, to be the best plumber in the world, rather than forcing him or her to go for an MBA and create a future generation of unemployed MBA people.
I think this debate will continue to go on. There are still lobbyists and activists, politicians who are calling for a higher minimum wage than what has been agreed, set to come in January 1st. This debate is also going on in Western countries, with more and more people calling for a more humane wage. What would be your counter-argument to them? What would you say? Where would you point them to go to for the evidence and to say that minimum wage does not work?
Well, it's enough to Google and find researches on the real effects of minimum wage. Again, as I mentioned before, there are recent studies that show that usually the implementation of minimum wage brings out higher unemployment. So now, thanks to internet, we have access to a lot of research and data are there. They are not difficult to find. Of course, again, I understand the political argument. I understand its appeal on people. And in Europe, we have, different problems with the issue of migrants, and therefore, every argument that can help anger and revenge feelings is politically paying back. But when you want to prepare a sound plan for the development of your country, you cannot simply go to what ignite the heart and the blood of the people. You have to look at serious arguments and what is really best for the people.
Carmelo Ferlito, thank you very much again for speaking to me today.
Thanks to you.
You've been listening to Live and Learn, VFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.